Mark as a narrative. So this entire class is about examining the Gospels as narratives and why we should be doing that and the fruits that we glean when we do that. And we've entered that portion of the class where, we've talked about the Gospels in general. We've looked at some of their literary features just in general. But now we're in that portion of the class where we're starting to look at each individual Gospel. And we're starting with Mark, and just a little heads up, I was planning for this class to finish our section on Mark, and we would start Matthew next week. But the material that I want to cover today is just too much for one class. I would have been rushing through it, so we're going to just call an audible, and I'm going to have one additional class on Mark's Gospel. So today we will discuss a few things about the theme of conflict in Mark's Gospel, because that's what we're focusing on. And then we'll discuss the first guided reading question that I had given to you, which I'll bring up here in a second. And then next Sunday, we'll finish that by looking at guided reading questions 2 and 3, and that way we can really take our time and examine some of these things. I do want to make one clarification from last week. Last week, we talked about how Mark uses verbal threads. And in your book, and I discussed this briefly, one of the verbal threads in Mark's narrative is the concept of the way. But later in that class, I was also using the phrase verbal link. And I failed to really differentiate those two. So let me just briefly clarify. A verbal thread is where an author uses a particular term or phrase throughout the narrative. So it's a thread that just runs through the story. For example, the way in Mark's Gospel. If I ever use the term verbal link, what I mean by that is it's when an author is using a phrase or term to link two episodes together. So for example, last week when we talked about where in the baptism account, and Mark says that the heavens were torn, and he uses that same expression that he's going to use later in the gospel when he talks about the temple veil being torn at the crucifixion of Jesus. And we noted that Mark is inviting us to compare those two episodes. Well, one of the ways he's inviting us to do that and drawing our attention to those two episodes is in that verbal link where he uses the same phraseology or the same term to discuss the tearing of the heavens when Jesus is declared to be the Son of God at his baptism, and then later the tearing of the temple veil when Jesus is declared to be the Son of God by the Roman centurion. So a verbal link is where the author is using a phrase, a term, or maybe an expression to link a couple episodes together because he's saying, hey, I want you to compare these two. I want you to think about these two in relation to each other. I wanted to clarify that because I did not clarify that last week, and I was using both terms, and so it may have sounded like I was using them interchangeably, but they're not. They are different in what those two terms are referring to. Now, I had given you some guided reading questions to use as you read Mark's Gospel because we were going to examine Mark's theme of conflict. And we're going to focus on that element of his narrative today. And in doing that, we're going to meet this objective. This was our fourth objective for the class. That you will be able, by the end of this class, you will be able to summarize unique themes, unique emphases of each gospel. And we'll begin to do that today with Mark's Gospel. We began to do that last week, but we'll build on that today as well as next Sunday as we examine, as I said, the theme of conflict, but then next Sunday we'll examine how does that theme of conflict also relate to the theme of discipleship, because discipleship is a major theme in Mark's Gospel. And so we will develop that theme next week. And so by the end of these classes on Mark, if I've done my job well, you should be able to have a grasp of these particular themes in Mark and how he emphasizes them, how he builds on them and develops them in his narrative. Now, before we get to the guided reading questions, I do want to have a brief section on this theme of conflict in Mark's Gospel. So this isn't related to anything that you read. It wasn't related to the guided reading questions. But these are some points I want us to make as we consider what Mark's narrative is all about when it comes to conflict. And so if you're using your book, these are the first few blanks on page 22 there. Here are some general observations about the theme of conflict in Mark. A fundamental point we need to recognize is that God's rule is the cause of all the conflicts in Mark's gospel. God's rule is the cause of all the conflicts in Mark. It is God's rule, His reign, that is alluded to in the opening verses of the narrative. Would you turn to Mark chapter 1? Let's look at these again here. Mark chapter 1. Mark opens his narrative with an Old Testament citation. Really, it's a combination of Old Testament passages. And these are very important for understanding what this narrative is all about. So look with me in Mark chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Now Mark credits this citation to Isaiah. It's actually a combination. He's crediting it to Isaiah, but he's using a combination of passages. The first part of the citation is from Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. And in the context of that passage, Yahweh of hosts, which is the name of God that Malachi is using throughout that section, it is a regal, kingly title for God. He is Yahweh of the heavenly hosts, the heavenly armies. And in Malachi 3:1, God is saying, I'm going to come back and I'm going to enforce my authority, my rule in creation. That means judgment on the wicked, but it also means vindication for the righteous, the faithful. And then the other passage that Mark is citing is from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. And in the context of that passage, it is also talking about Yahweh coming as king to enforce his rulership in the world he has made. And just like with Malachi, it will include, among other things, judgment on the wicked and vindication for the righteous, comfort for his people. So it's very important that we understand when Mark starts his narrative, he's starting it by cluing us in, and to any Jewish reader, would have made perfect sense, that, hey, remember when God promised to come as king and rule in creation and to exercise his power? That good news is starting with this man, Jesus of Nazareth. And this is what Jesus himself then announces. Skip down in chapter 1 of Mark to verse 14. Look at Mark 1:14. This is where Mark gives us a summary of Jesus' message that he was preaching. Now, after John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee proclaiming the good news of God, the gospel of God, and saying, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. Many scholars will argue, and have argued, that really a better translation of that is that the reign of God is at hand. Because the point of the word in this context is about God's activity as king. He's not announcing a place, where the place of God is at hand. Nor is he announcing, as it's sometimes discussed in our circles, the church. This is not an announcement that the church is at hand. Now, God's rulership will include the formation of a people. Yes, it will include that. But to say that this is about the church is to put the emphasis on the wrong syllable, if you catch my meaning. It's to put the cart before the horse. Jesus is announcing the kingship of God that was promised in the prophets. That time is now, and it is in me. And Mark is saying that the reign of God has come in this man from Nazareth. So the rest of the narrative of Mark, the rest of the narrative is about what type of a reign is God going to exercise? What does his rulership look like? And how do beings, both material and angelic, both earthly and spiritual, how do beings respond to the kingship of God? The conflict in Mark's gospel is from negative responses to God's kingship. Either willful opposition to it, or in the case of the disciples, which we'll talk about next Sunday, conflict born from a misunderstanding because of a lack of faith and hard hearts. So as we think about conflict in Mark, we need to recognize this fundamental point, that God's rule is the cause of all the conflict in Mark's gospel. And then the second point related to this one that we need to recognize is that conflicts with Jesus are conflicts with God himself. That is something important we need to recognize about the conflicts in Mark's gospel. Conflicts with Jesus are conflicts with God himself. He is the agent of God's kingship. He is the Davidic king. And so to oppose Jesus is to oppose Yahweh of hosts. To oppose Jesus is to oppose God himself. Let me stop here. What questions or thoughts do you have on these two fundamental points about conflict in Mark's gospel? Yes, ma'am, Miss Glenda. Yes. Yeah, Mark's gospel is about the kingship of God coming into a world that is openly hostile to it. And that's no different than today. That's why God's people today are mocked just like they were mocked in the first century. That's why Christianity is mocked today just like it was in the first century. So we still live in a world where, yes, the kingship of God has been inaugurated in Jesus Christ, but it hasn't yet been fully consummated. That will come at his return, where everything about his rulership will now be enforced and the new creation will be consummated. But for now, there is still a measure of conflict that exists in tension with the kingship of God that has come in Jesus Christ. Yeah, Andrew? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. In fact, we'll talk about Satan in just a moment. But yeah, Andrew just said Satan is the chief instigator of this conflict. And absolutely right. And Mark presents that in his narrative, which we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. So my last part of just kind of establishing this theme in Mark is to discuss with you reasons why God's rule is opposed. Why is it that God's rule is opposed in creation? And just so you know, I want to give credit where credit is due here. I'm leaning heavily in this section on the book Mark as Story, which is in the bibliography at the end of your book. It's a wonderful section on this theme there, and I'm just borrowing from that. I'm leaning heavily on him because he makes some great observations about this in examining Mark's narrative. So here's one reason why God's rule evokes opposition in creation. It restores God's creation intentions. It restores God's creation intentions. What forces wouldn't want this? What forces are interested in corrupting creation out of a desire for power? What are those forces in Mark's narrative that would be interested in creation's corruption? Hint, Andrew just mentioned it. Satan and the demons. Satan and the demons. In Mark's narrative, this is the first conflict that occurs when Jesus goes into the wilderness. This is what launches his ministry, the victory of Jesus over Satan in the wilderness, which then allows Jesus to go and exorcise demons, which is an extension of his victory over Satan in the wilderness, which we'll look at that in more detail here in a few minutes. The current order of the cosmos is that Satan and demons have some degree of power over human beings. God's kingship reverses that. restores authority into the hands of human beings. In fact, I want to illustrate this with a passage that is just teeming with theological riches that we could talk about, but I want to look at it from one angle. Go to Mark chapter 5. You're familiar with the story, but I want us to see something here along the lines of this point. Mark 5. This is where Jesus encounters the man who is possessed by a legion of demons. Now, we're not going to read the whole passage. I want to just point out one thing about this because it illustrates what Satan and the demonic forces are all about. So look at chapter 5, and we'll start reading in verse 1. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. Let me stop there. Is that God's creation intention for human beings made in His image? To have been domineered and subdued by demonic forces who seek this man's destruction, cutting himself with stones, living in the tombs, just mad. That's not what God intended. But this is the current order of creation, that Satan and demonic forces have a measure of power over human beings. But when the man, Jesus, and I want to emphasize his humanity here, because this is important. The one who defeats this legion of demons single-handedly is a human being. Yes, it's God incarnate, but let's emphasize the fact that God is doing this in the form of a human being. There is theological significance to that. He is restoring His creation intention where He said in Genesis 1, to man and woman, I am giving dominion over everything I have made. That has been reversed. In the current order, we don't have dominion over nature. Nature sometimes kills human beings made in God's image. We don't have dominion over Satan and the demonic forces, but that changes with Jesus of Nazareth, where now a human being stands before a legion of Satan's armies and without any struggle defeats them. He's given authority. Authority for humanity is restored in Jesus. And when God is then going to use His kingship to put dominion back into the hands of human beings, Satan and the demonic forces are going to resist that with everything they've got. Because that means their downfall, their defeat. This is one reason why the rule of God evokes opposition. What questions or thoughts do you have on this first reason? What questions or thoughts do you have on this? Yes, ma'am. Tasha? Did I remember? Okay, good. Tasha. Yes, so very good. So when think about it this way. Think about the narrative of Genesis. Man and woman are given dominion over the beasts of the field, birds of the heavens, the creeping things on the earth. They are to be God's authority on creation. Dominion is given to them. They're to rule in His name. So there is significance then when they are subdued, so to speak, or they relinquish their authority to a serpent, the spiritual being that they were supposed to have authority over, in the form of a serpent. There's significance there. Because what it means is human beings, and this is what Paul talks about at the beginning of Romans, where human beings have given up their glory of God in order to worship animals, to worship idols, and to submit themselves to the very things that they were supposed to have dominion over. Jesus restores that. So when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, it was a relinquishing of our authority to be God's rulers in creation, and now we will be ruled over because we sought to make ourselves God. We sought to usurp the king. And so in doing that, we then became subdued by sin and Satan and death and all those things that come with it. Jesus restores that. He's restoring those creation intentions. Does that help to clarify? Okay. Satan didn't waste any time. He did not. That's right. Well, there's another reason that God's rule is opposed in Mark's gospel. And we could say it like this: it restores God's social intentions. It restores God's, what we might call, social intentions. What I mean by that is how human beings relate to one another. Now, what forces wouldn't want this? What forces would oppose the fact that God is wanting to restore humanity to where humans serve one another? What forces would want nothing to do with that? Humans who want to rule over others out of a self-serving desire for power. And this is exactly what Jesus tells the disciples when they themselves are wrestling with this very point. I have it up here on the screen in Mark 10, 42 to 45. And Jesus called the disciples to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus will manifest this teaching in Jerusalem, where he will become the slave of all on the cross. An act of service to all humanity that will act as a ransom for them. And in living out this teaching of God's rule, or I should say, in living out this quality of the rulership of God, where his kingship is not one that domineers and lords over others. His kingship is one that serves humanity even to the point of death. That's the type of king that God is. And that's what he calls his disciples to follow. And when Jesus lives this out in Jerusalem, he will then draw upon himself all of the hostility of the Jewish leaders who want power for themselves, all of the hostility of Rome, who views itself and wants to maintain its position of power, because their view of power is antithetical to God's kingship. It's opposed to everything that God's rule stands for. Ms. Glenda, can I finish this point? 1 second. I got one more thing to say, and then I'll get you. Just so I don't get off track. The current order of the cosmos, the current order of creation, is that some humans lord over others out of a self-serving desire for power. And that includes how some use religion, as the Jewish teachers exemplify in Mark's narrative. Some use religion to domineer others and promote their self-superiority. God's rule seeks to restore his social intentions, where every human being mirrors his sacrificial character. Every human being serves others the way he has served humanity, thus making every human equal before his throne. But that is not something that the forces of this world who want power for themselves are going to go along with. And so that's going to evoke conflict. Yes, ma'am, Miss Glenda. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Jewish leaders exemplify the type of power and authority that Jesus is criticizing here in Mark 10. They seek to lord over others, and they're not going to let this Nazarene take that from them. Yes. Yes. So Craig is already going ahead of us. He's already thinking the next week. So that's what we'll talk about next week. The disciples themselves will wrestle with this very thing because in their mind, to be the disciples of Jesus means power and prestige for them. And Jesus is trying to tell them, no, that is not what it means. Now, they won't get it in the narrative itself. They'll get it later. Mark doesn't record in his explicit detail their coming around like the other Gospels do. But they'll get it after the resurrection. They'll understand. And a lot of them, at least a lot of them, will die for it because they'll follow in Jesus' footsteps. Another reason that God's rule evokes opposition is that it's acting outside traditional channels of power. This is similar to the last point, but a slightly different emphasis here. In other words, when God's rule comes in Jesus of Nazareth, it does not follow the established norms of Jewish thinking, or really human thinking. Because when Jesus brings God's kingship to earth, forgiveness is now offered in himself rather than at the temple. And God's reign starts acting not in Jerusalem and Judea, but in Galilee. And Jesus is not seeking the religious elite. Oh, the reign of God must be for these people. Look at how much they keep the Torah, and look at how righteous they are in the prayers that they offer. Look at how much they give in the temple. That's not where Jesus goes. He goes to prostitutes, tax collectors, in some cases, Gentiles. What? This is the reign of God? And he's criticizing the Jewish teachers. When God's reign comes, it does not follow traditional channels of power. And those that are attached to those traditional channels of power are not going to like that. And then one more reason. And then we'll have kind of a summary reason here. One reason that God's rule evokes opposition in Mark's narrative is that it removes boundaries of uncleanness. It removes boundaries of uncleanness. The Jewish world had created boundaries to guard against what's unclean. Now, this was not inherently wrong. This is how the Hebrew Scriptures regulated life and set it up. The problem was that some in Jesus' day had used these boundaries as a means to promote their superiority and as a means to treat others as inferior. But when Jesus comes on the scene, he starts eradicating these boundaries. He's touching lepers. He's touching dead bodies. He's not forcing his disciples to wash their hands before they eat. He's allowing them to break the Sabbath. He's forgiving sins. This is blasphemous. This is not a man who cares about Torah like we do, the Jewish teachers. And what they fail to realize is that God's reign has come into creation to make clean what was unclean and to make holy what was unholy. The cleanness and the holiness of Jesus, rather than him being contaminated by the unclean, his holiness and cleanness extends to those he reaches out to. So now they are clean. Now that means, if you're going to accept that, you have to accept, among other things, that Jesus' interpretation of Torah is correct and the Jewish leaders' interpretation is wrong, and that is not something they are willing to accept. There's no way this Nazarene knows the law better than we do. And so that is going to be a source of conflict in Mark's narrative. And then finally, we can summarize all of this with this last point. All of these things we've discussed create a new understanding of God. All of these things we've discussed create a new understanding of God. And this is why there's conflict in Mark's narrative. God is not operating in ways that were expected. He's doing things that just don't seem to fit the preconceived categories of his kingship that we had been expecting or that we thought. And this is why in Mark's narrative, when you have at the very beginning of Mark's narrative those 5 accounts of conflict that we looked at, where Mark starts with conflict very early in his narrative, and he hits you with 5 repeated incidents. There is perhaps some meaning to the fact that the middle of those 5 is where Jesus talks about putting old wine into new wineskins. Because that parable is really explaining the conflict in the entire narrative. Because the Jewish leaders are judging the new wine that has come in Jesus by the categories of their old wineskins. And in doing that, they destroy the wine, and they end up destroying the wineskins as well. And so this new understanding of God that Jesus is presenting, the Jewish leaders are not going to accept that. They already know who God is. They know that he would not be operating in this Nazarene. And if it looks like this Nazarene is doing the things of God by his power, well, it's really the power of Satan that he's using. And we'll look at that in just a second. So these are all the reasons why God's rule evokes opposition in Mark's narrative. What questions or thoughts do you have before we look at our first guided reading question, and then we'll close with that examination? What thoughts or questions do you have on all these reasons? It just kind of summarizes this theme of conflict in Mark and what evokes opposition to it. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. They were expecting a different idea of kingship. In fact, I don't remember if I can't remember if I put it in your class book or if I'm thinking of another class that I'm working on. But there's a famous passage from a work called the Psalms of Solomon, which is an intertestamental Jewish work. And probably it was at least finished around the first century when Jesus lived. And I think it's the 17th Psalm of Solomon that talks about the Messiah who will come and will rule over the Gentiles, who will clear the land of the pagans. And it is expressing the very concept that you're talking about, where it's this type of king who's going to eradicate sinners and reward Israel. Now, that's not altogether wrong. We need to make clear, the prophets did promise that. But how God was going to do that is going to be very different than what they were expecting. Yeah, Andrew? Yeah. 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 Yes. In fact, I'm not saying oh, go ahead, sorry. They rejected him because of it. And I would word it this way, not because I think what you said is wrong, but I think this hits a little closer to what Jesus is showing. It's not that he's showing what a true leader is like. He's showing what leadership is like as God defines the concept, rather than men. I just would want to emphasize that there, because I think that's so important, is because when he comes and he's showing, here's the type of king that God is, it is just so far removed from how humans think of kingship and leadership, because we are tainted with sin, and we view things more through the lens of Satan so often than we do through the eyes of God, and he's trying to restore that. So I had asked you to read Mark with 3 questions in mind, just to help you focus on this theme. We're going to look at just the first one, and here was the question I had asked you. What is a difference you notice between Jesus' conflict with demonic forces and his conflict with humans? What are your thoughts? If you got to read it and think about this, what did you discover? What are some differences you noticed between Jesus' conflict with demonic forces versus his conflict with human beings? Yeah, Tasha? The demonic forces obey him without question. The human beings do not. And he allows that. Julia? They recognize who Jesus is. Human beings do not. Maddie? Jesus doesn't offer forgiveness to the demons. There is no gospel for them. There's no good news for them. Well, how do you mean respect him? Yeah, they obey. The reason I respect, I'm kind of like, they're rebels, but uh, they can't stand with him toe to toe. He just overpowers them. Yes, okay, I got you. They don't ever say anything about him that is insulting. They don't dare say, hey, stupid, whatever. Just they are very much they very much recognize we are in the presence of someone who can destroy us. And that's why when they see Jesus a lot of times in Mark, you'll see where they're like, please do not destroy us. I mean, they recognize that they're up against somebody who's more powerful than they are. Yeah, very good. What else? Anyone else? They obeyed him. Yeah. That's right. That's right. That's right. They obey. When he tells them to be quiet, they're quiet. They don't say anything. What else? Anyone else have any that as you read Mark's gospel, as you were thinking about this? Yeah, it gives us some glimpses on what it'll be, when God's reign is fully consummated, and what it will look like when human beings are given that authority over Satan. There's a reason Paul in Romans, I can't remember the chapter. Shoot, I think it's Romans 12, when Paul says that God will soon crush Satan under your feet. We are going to share in that authority of Christ, in that victory, by being the means by which God defeats Satan and his rebellious forces. We will share in that, led by our King, Jesus of Nazareth. Well, I've got some thoughts up here, and really I'm just adding to the good things you've already said. I've summarized my thoughts as 3 short verses statements. And here's the first one. We could summarize the differences between between Jesus' conflict with demons versus his conflict with humans. We could summarize the difference in this expression: power versus service. Power versus service. In other words, when Jesus encounters demonic forces, as you've already mentioned, it's a showdown of power. It's just raw power. He overpowers them and he tells them what to do and they do it. In every instance, he just overpowers them. And yet when he encounters opposing human beings, he doesn't command them to obey, using his kingly power to force them to comply like he does with the demonic forces. Rather, he serves humanity, again, to the point of death. In fact, he allows the human rebels to impose their evil will on him and lets them crucify him. That's the difference, or a difference, between what God's rulership means for human beings versus what it means for Satan and his demonic forces. And then an additional nuance to this difference, we could summarize it this way: binding versus liberation. Binding versus liberation. This is another summary statement that gets at the difference between Jesus' conflict with demons versus his conflict with humans. Would you go to Mark chapter 3? I want to illustrate this one. Go to Mark 3. We'll look at a very important episode here in Mark's narrative. We're going to look at verses 22 to 27. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, "He is possessed by Beelzebul, And by the prince of demons, he casts out demons. And he called them to him and said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house. We'll stop there. This episode summarizes this difference here. When it comes to Satan and the demonic forces, Jesus' power in this conflict is one of binding. When he says you can't enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless you've bound to the strong man in this parable is Satan. What he's saying to the Jewish leaders is, I wouldn't be able to exorcise these demons if I had not first already defeated their leader, Satan himself. I have bound to the strong man, so now I can plunder his goods, which are human beings that he has taken for himself. He's liberating human beings that Satan has bound. But that's a humongous difference. And this, with human beings, this liberation that he brings to them is manifested in his healings, in his exorcisms, as we've mentioned, in his extension of forgiveness to them. But to Satan and the demons, it is just a binding, an imprisoning. That's a key difference between how Jesus encounters or deals with conflict with Satan and demons versus how he deals with us, with human beings. And then finally, there's one last statement I'd use to summarize these differences related to these first two, again, but with a little different emphasis, which we'll discuss. And we can use this phrase, domination versus invitation. Domination versus invitation. As I've already stated, with the demons, Jesus dominates them. They are compelled to obey him by his power, his greater power. But with human beings, his message is one of invitation to participate with him in the rule of God, to enjoy its blessings. And this is summed up in the very words of Jesus, because think about it. To the demons, Jesus' words are, be silent, come out of him. But to human beings, his words are, follow me. And there is a world of difference in that. As we wrap up today's lesson on just this first guided reading question, let me close with some thoughts that will summarize what we learn about God's kingship as we see it in Mark's narrative. From Mark, we learn that God is a king who serves us. This is not in your book, by the way. God is a king who serves us rather than lords it over us and domineers us, even though we would deserve that treatment, because he's God and we are his creation. But he serves us. And God is a king who liberates us. He wants to use his kingly power to free human beings. And then finally, God is a king who invites us. He is a king who invites us to his very table, to sit at table with him and share in the blessings of his rulership. This is the type of king who God is. And Mark's narrative then leaves us with a question that is answered in various ways in his very narrative. And it is this question: how will you respond to God's kingship? How will you respond to God's kingship? With opposition Will you oppose it and oppose Jesus, or will you follow him? And then enjoy all the blessings that God's kingship offers. And one of the great examples in Mark's narrative that he gives as to what a proper response to God's kingship looks like is actually in that very narrative that we didn't finish, but where he exorcises the legion of demons. And then we're told this is what Jesus says to that man after he's been healed. He says, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. That's a proper response to God's kingship. When you are so grateful and full of gratitude for the liberation that God has given to you through his rulership, that you just want to go out and you want to tell everybody about him. And if we are people who, like the possessed man, have been liberated by God from our sins, from death itself, then the question is, are we responding with this type of enthusiasm? Or do we just kind of treat this whole meaning of Christianity and discipleship just nonchalantly? Yeah, go to church, just kind of flippant about it. Mark gives us this man as one of his paradigms to say this is how you should respond, because God's kingship has done wonders for us. And so we should be telling everybody we can about it. Now, next week, we'll finish these guided reading questions for Mark. We'll look at questions 2 and 3. If you didn't get a chance to read Mark's narrative with these questions in mind, I'd invite you to do so this week. And as you read Mark's gospel, just look, or as you're reading it, be aware of how does Jesus, or what are the causes of conflict between Jesus and the disciples? What causes them to be in conflict with each other? And then the third guided reading question is, what lessons can we learn from that about discipleship? And that's what we'll discuss next week. Thank you for your kind attention today. God be with you this week.